Good morning, everyone. Are we 11 o'clock? We are 11 o'clock. Good timing. Thank you for tuning in today. Sorry, I'm just looking at the numbers in the room. We have a lot of people still coming in. This has been one of the the webinars with the most registrations. So I'm conscious that I'm going to run a couple of minutes past 11 just to let people get into the room. It's probably no surprise that this webinar has been as popular as it has been, given the debate going on, particularly in the UK at the minute, over safe standing in stadiums and stuff like that. I think depending on your vintage and what age you were and what you remember about football and going to watch matches, not just football, but mainly football, standing at matches was always a huge thing, and a lot of people think it's a fundamental part of enjoying a live football experience. So that all feeds into the debate and the research and everything around safe standing for matches, which has been going on, and that Ian Mixter, your presenter this morning, has been involved in. A couple of things we need to say about this session. Ian and I have had fun in the last couple of days, in particular, sorting the technology for his presentation. So for anyone who has been on some of the other presentations, you might notice a slight difference in this one, particularly in the second half of the presentation. Ian has a number of videos that he would have taken himself and recorded on an iPhone during the research he did on this project. And anyone who knows about iPhones and the way they save videos, they're really, really large files. So we've had to split up the presentation into different sections of slides and to get the videos done separately and all sorts of things. So what I'm saying is the second half of the presentation, it's going to be a little clunkier. I'm not sure that's a word, but it'll be a little clunkier than what you're probably maybe used to on these. So we'll be hopping in and out of videos, and you may see Ian's head and my head pop up for a couple of seconds while we move from videos to slides. So apologies if that affects your overall webinar experience, but it's the message, and the message here is key, and the research is what we're looking at. So that will be mainly in the second half. We're going to do a Q&A session at the end. We're not going to stop in the middle or during the presentation like we have in some others to do Q&A. So we will do a Q&A session at the end. So like we always say, use the chat function over there on the right-hand side. Pop your questions in there. You'll see us, when we spot a question in there, we mark it with red, a red Q, or I think it's a red circle and a white Q, same thing. You'll see it marked, and we've flagged it as a question. We know it's a question you guys want answered, and we'll track them and we'll put them to Ian in the Q&A section at the end. We tend to try and keep presenters till we get answers to all those questions. If we can answer all those questions, sometimes we can't. Sometimes the nature of the question, there is no answer, or there's no simple answer. But we will get ready to do those at the end. One of the first things, I'm going to pop a quick poll up very quickly. If none of these apply to you, feel free not to pick one. Don't pick one if it doesn't apply. But we're just interested in seeing what people's backgrounds are. So pop an answer into that poll if one of those applies to you. If it doesn't apply to you, don't worry about it. You don't have to make something up. We just want to see roughly who we've got in the room. Given the nature of this webinar, we figure we kind of know who will be in the room, but it's always worth checking to see. Also, some people, a couple of them might apply to you. Feel free to pick one over the other. It's not an absolute science, but we just wanted to get a vague handle on who was in the room. Another thing I wanted to say for Ian's benefit mainly is he built a beautiful PowerPoint presentation for this and put a lot of work into it. Because of the videos and what we've had to do to make this work in the back end, as any of you who are vaguely familiar with presentations and technology will know, things go slightly wrong sometimes. So what has happened is his fonts and some of the alignment within his presentation have moved a little bit since we've uploaded into the back end of the system. So I don't think it's going to affect anyone's enjoyment of the presentation, but I just wanted to mention it because having seen what we started originally with versus the little changes the software has made and the way it's moved a couple of things, I felt bad for Ian. So I just said I'd mention that. So we're looking at nearly 2/3 call themselves event professionals, which is good. And we do have maybe 16, 17% in here who are safety officers or who work in that kind of a role, which is good. I'd imagine this could be one of the sessions where we have decent chat interaction, and feel free, if you've been on some of the other ones, the CDM regs one was a good one as well, where we had a lot of interaction in the chat. People were answering their own questions, people were talking back and forth, and we've had a number of attendees on that one in particular come back to us since, saying that they got a lot out of the chat side of things as well as the presentation. So don't be afraid to put your opinion in there or help answer a question if you have an answer. We are keen that people get value out of whatever element of this they're getting value out of. So if the chat helps as well, we're all for that. One more quick poll before we introduce Ian. We were just keen to have a handle on where people are based. Again, the options are based on where we have seen people sign up from. Don't give out to me if your exact location is represented there. We had to kind of go on the top 6 that we saw people registering for. So it's just registering is one thing. We're always keen to actually know then who in the room on the day who actually makes it, because obviously you have a little bit of drop off versus who registered. Things come up. We've had a good few emails this morning from people who were on shifts overnight or whatever, or had an emergency and won't be able to make it into the room. So they were just checking would recordings be available. So recording for this will be available. You can take it now for all of these Event Insights webinars, that recordings will be available. And if you're registered for the webinar, you will get an email that sends you a link to that recording. So don't worry, if you register for the webinar, you will get that link. It'll go out as an automatic mail after a couple of days, usually within a day or two, and possibly with the same day you would get the certificate of attendance as well to just confirm that you've been here. So with that all said, like I said, use the chat. You can use the red tab to minimize the chat if it's distracting you. Just remember then, if we put other polls live or give you documents to download or anything, they'll be over there in that section. So you'll need to go back in there into that red tab just to find them. They're quite easy to find, but they do live in there. So if you minimize that because it's bothering you or it's distracting you, just remember the other stuff lives in there too. I think that's it. Use the chat, ask questions. We'll come to them at the end if we can. Once again, apologies for any not so seamless transitions that we have in the second half of this. It's not Ian's fault. It was trying to get all his content to work on a webinar platform. It's beautifully designed to work on in a room if he's delivering a presentation, and we had to just try and make the same content work for a webinar, which is not. It didn't work perfectly, but we think all the content's available. You'll get it all, and you'll understand the message, which is the point. So I'm going to hand over to Ian, and let me just get his first slides up, and I'll talk to you guys in a while. I hope you enjoy it.
Right. Good morning, everybody. As the name on the slides say, Ian Mixter, and we're sort of here, hopefully, to learn a little bit about stadium safety. Where do we stand? Not only in terms of, as Mark has said, of the safe standing debate, but the sharing really of best practice. And I think it's quite key, really, what the CPD sessions that have started through Mark and various others in this time of lockdown, and how we can all hopefully learn from each other. Right. I think really it was important to, before we started, really in the main context, just to give you a little bit of my background. I remember many years ago now listening to Chris Akabusi at a presentation, and he spoke very much about CPD and the trust equation, and a book that came out of a book called the Trusted Advisor. Really, where did the audience or the people that you're projecting to really have any confidence in the message that you were delivering, really? So probably in terms of policing and safety, probably in terms of events, my time in the police split between the Metropolitan Police and the British Transport Police, really where we're looking at for events, crowds of New Year's Eve, probably up to about 130,000 into Waterloo. And then the managing of the crowds in and out of Wembley Park Station, not only on football days, but some of the event days. And then that in itself suggested some logistical challenges. You go back to the work of John Dury and Psychology of Crowds and how different crowds behave, etc. It's quite interesting, particularly with our bosses at the time. Well, you need X amount of people. Well, you don't, because different crowds present different problems to you. We had the infamous Madonna Sticky and Sweet tour in 2008, where we had a sort of a late show and a lockout of people. Different things like Oasis, which is probably the worst event I think we've ever dealt with, really, in terms of some of the behaviour of the fans coming through the station afterwards. And then really like Crotch v Groves in the boxing 2016 in the lead up, at a time before Night Tube. A counter-terrorism and search, I'll link in together just to give that a little bit of background. My first real experience of sort of counter-terrorism and search, I suppose, was crawling around on my hands and knees when the IRA tried to blow up Staples Corner in etc. At that time. Then moving on, there was the BBC bomb. I was there in charge on that particular occasion in the early 2000s, and then moving on into the BTP, I suppose, just managing at the time operationally the counter-terrorism unit on the London Underground, for a while, and all that it came in, and if the search as well, also in terms of the police search advisor searching in confined spaces, etc. Planning and public order coming together. Again, for those of you that are looking, for research, and I know when Mark first started this, they were looking at event students, particularly, the readings of Clifford Stott and various other people in terms of public order, because I went from a PC at poll tax right the way through to the unfortunate events after the shooting of Mark Duggan in late 2011, really, and everything in between, including the infamous Kettling poll tax on 2001 on May Day. And for those of you that are in research and in the chat rooms, a very interesting book as an aside called Mad Mobs and Englishmen, which was a retrospective view, of the riots in 2011, which is certainly well worth the read. A major incident, Heathrow Tunnel collapse. There's some interesting videos on YouTube for that as well. And also as well, a Virgin airliner coming down at Heathrow, etc. in 1997. So there's a vast of dealing with crowds at the side of the plane when they pop the chutes for that. Football, not only in terms of Wembley, but also going back. And I think that gave me the strength in terms of the safe standing of being a football spotter, back, in the early 90s, in terms of dealing with hooligan groups, etc. And then really, if you sort of move on then to safety officer, I was a safety officer for Oxford United Football Club, various events in between, some operational planning in terms of events, shopping centre openings, etc. And then search as well, did the search for D-Day on terms of being in charge of the SIA search lanes. And I know Pete Dalton has spoke quite eloquently about protective security and the layers and his involvement there. Well, mine was obviously further down the food chain at that stage, from previously being a silver and a bronze in the police, but actually managing the SIA search teams. And obviously since then I've sort of moved into training and assessing and some project management, really, in relation to Brexit. So I wanted to give you a flavour that I actually had the trust and confidence. Well, it's not only having experience, I'll actually think about qualifications, and this really brings a smile to my face, really. If you look at the top one, and most of those, other than the police degree, have been achieved probably since I left the police in 2015. Interesting, actually, that degree in crowd safety management, the dissertation was about compulsory CPD for safety officers, which wasn't really very well received by some colleagues at the time, who actually said, well, we did a level 4 X amount of years ago. Why do we need to probably increase our knowledge? Okay, not everyone, am a minority, but some. And yet in times now, we've probably never done so much CPD in our lives, which actually was my second choice, because the first one was about information sharing within the private security industry. But no one would share any information to do the dissertation. And look at us now sharing best practice for social distancing, etc. So some really, and I hope the messages continue to learn. So where are we going to do in this session? Quickly, we're going to have a historic overview, slightly different for me. Now it's quite important if we understand, for me, the lessons of yesterday, then that will certainly affect the teachings of today. And originally when this started, obviously, as Mark, I've reiterated, Mark was saying it was actually going to be aimed at event students, although there's some learned professionals on here. We're going to look at some of the legal aspects in the Green Guide. Then we're going to get to ops rails with the supporting safer spectators, and best practice, simple ideas for safety, and barrier testing. So where do we stand in terms of history? Really, if we go back really to the Flavian Amphitheatre, which obviously would be a coliseum. This slide really wanted to include for two reasons. We can't always change history, so we're just looking at the coliseum from a purely crowd management point of view. For me, the book that first introduced me to crowd management was From Ancient Rome to Rock and Roll by Mick Upton, where he spoke about that. And that was really one of the reasons I would include this. Unfortunately, in our industry, the word expert is used too frequently and often too lightly, in my opinion. But obviously, without the work of Mick Upton, I don't think any of us would be here today. So probably it's only right that, we pay tribute to someone who really stood us in good stead for the future. But then if you actually look at the picture on the right-hand side, you've actually probably what you've got there, if you'd actually fast forwarded that to the Green Guide, you've probably got a type 8 and a type 9 barrier with various loadings between 3 kilonewtons per metre and 2 kilonewtons per metre for the ones on the side, really. So they were quite ahead of their time. It was interesting that the work that Mick Upton did, following on from a BBC documentary about lost empires, in terms of he actually looked at the flow rate for the amphitheatre there, and he worked out that you could actually get quite safely between 45 to 60,000 people out working at the time. As he was working on the 4th edition of the Green Guide, admittedly at the time slightly different flow rates, because at the time that was 73 people per metre per minute. So some quite fantastic work there. And even then, when you look at the difference between security and safety in terms of that, then if you look back at the scriptures and the writings they were talking, there was even 3 types there. There was the VIP security. There were the security backstage in preparation at that time for the gladiators. But there was also ushers showing people to seats. And if you actually again look at scriptures, one of the house rules for ushers was in fact that they mustn't block the view of any spectators. I mean, and how many times have those of us that have been safety officer had complaints after the game or during the game or the event that the stewards are actually blocking my view because they were watching the event. And indeed, it is quite interesting. There was a chap, some bloke called Boris Johnson, who actually wrote a book in 2006 called Dreams of Rome, where he again spoke about VIPs security, with Caesar having 72 bodyguards at the time. So then we're moving on really to the Empire Stadium. That people would obviously potentially, and by the way, these should all have faded in. I tend to work without notes. I'll have some down here, but it mainly goes from memory. The Empire Stadium in 1923 was obviously built for the British Empire, the British Empire exhibition in 1924. It actually finished about 3 days before the event. So there was no test event. for this. So we've got 28th of April there, as it says. It was designed to hold up to 126,000 people. The first FA Cup final to be held at the stadium, because previously, although I don't know where people are from, although at the time in England, the FA Cup at the time was mainly, probably as it is now, being won by northern teams. They wanted to have the FA Cup final in London. So primarily up until then, it was based in and around Crystal Palace area. But what they actually had, as they first turned up, was probably, and reports go, anything between 235 and 250,000 people actually turned up, which actually then led to around 1,000 casualties. No fatalities, thankfully. And there was the short report that was commissioned at the time with a general overview, really, to look at abnormally large attendances on special occasions. You know, because we'd had previous, unfortunately, if you look back in time, we'd had disasters which had occurred in the United Kingdom, and primarily my talk at the moment is going to be based around England and Wales. But actually, if we go back in 1902, there was 25 people killed and 500 injured. An England-Scotland game at Ibrox, where the cause of that was a wooden terrace collapsing, which was really the first time that we started to implement safety, because they took away wooden terracing. Although, interesting at the time, there was no public inquiry. The Football Association at the time would not take part in any inquiry. But however, they were so worried about effects of the future that they actually became, at that stage, a public limited company, so as not to actually enforce or affect any litigation. Very quickly, what caused the problems here? 120 coaches had turned up, Northern Specials. There was only 35,000 advance ticket sales were allowed, because at the time they didn't want really to, they wanted to add to the crowds and a speculative walk up. Okay, there was a lot of concern at the time about what would now be called touts. They didn't want to print tickets in advance, etc. So it was that big good feel walk up. You then started to get this problem between the police and crowd safety, because there was a quite famous quote called Inspector. The superintendent Langdon from X District at the time in the Metropolitan Police, who actually turned around and said that unfortunately the class of football fans, the composite of football fans, was not particularly good, because they were made from the East End of London and a provincial industrial town. Because for those of you that aren't aware, that cup final was between Bolton Wanderers and West Ham United. But anyway, one of the things that happened is they ended up with thousands of people on the pitch. Very more famous, really. This is probably the White Horse Cup final, Billy the White Horse, and interestingly for football, PC Scory, who was the rider of the horse. Short did an inquiry into this, and even at that stage, and we're talking obviously many years before Hillsborough, he'd noted that there wasn't free access onto the pitch. There would have been a severe number of casualties. And also as well, at that stage, in fact, in his report, paragraph 40, if I recall correctly, he'd actually said that there was a danger to the crowds from wooden stands. And then we fast forward to the unfortunate events of Bradford, and we find out what, some of those lessons were. Well, how did we get to this stage? We had a very efficient transport system at this time. Maybe things have regressed slightly, who knows. In his report, he actually talked about what would now maybe be the last mile or Zone X. In the fact is that there should be management of the 200 yards, his minimum distance between the stadium and a transport hub. Quite fascinating, really. Higher perimeter fence, better ticketing, increased signage. If there were too many people at the ground, he even was suggesting stop people at the transport hubs there and divert them away. Quite ahead of his time. Actually, as well, in terms of safety officer role, one person in charge of the whole ground at a time in telephonic communication with the whole ground. Quite ahead of his time. So we move on to Burnden Park. Again, unfortunately, probably one of the forgotten probably events. Bolton Wanderers against Stoke City. Prior to that, we'd had 1934. We'd had one person crushed to death at Hillsborough in a crowd of something just under 73,000. But this game, 9th of March, estimated crowd 80,000 plus inside. Unfortunately, 33 people lost their lives, over 400 injured. That led to the Hughes report. What happened here? Obviously, they were expecting 50,000. 23, they stopped access, locked the turnstiles. Still had 15,000 odd people plus outside. People started to climb over the fence. There was some crushing. A man, it's reported, with his son managed to get out through opening an exit, which then let even more people in. Barriers gave way, etc. Again, it was quite shocking. Interesting though, the game went ahead. It wasn't stopped. The worst tragedy at the time in football. And indeed, there was a game 4 days later when Bolton Wanderers played Bradford. The Hughes report actually then said that football, working class sport, was becoming very popular with the masses, and a future incident could not be ruled out. So what he recommended was a licensing scheme by the local authorities. Again, that seems a perfectly reasonable suggestion in my opinion. However, that the clubs didn't like that because they feared too much regulation. They feared too much interference, and in fact, they felt that the authorities would actually at that time be too cautious. So they actually adopted a period of self-regulation, and that's how it moved forward. Because at the time, and indeed, going back to the Short report and things like that, the Secretary of Manchester United at the time of the Short report, was actually quoted as saying, "The clubs already know what to do in terms of safety." So we moved on to Ibrox Park. Again, January 1971, estimated 80,000. 66 people unfortunately lost their lives simply going to a football game. And that led on to the Wheatley report. Now, you can see there from those two pictures the unfortunate barriers that gave way on Stairway 13. There'd always been previous incidents at Ibrox. We'd already spoken about the 1902 incident wasn't really reported very well. With 1961, we've actually had 2 people lose their lives, 44 injured. We're going on to 1967, 11 people injured. We then go on to 1969, 2 years before, 30 people seriously injured, all on this same stairwell. So the Wheatley report, then it started leading on to the Safety at Sports Grounds Act that we will talk about as we move forward. And it's interesting as well, out of this came the Green Guide, 1973. And it's interesting, the fact is that politics was really starting to get involved now, and such was the public outcry, because actually that act was actually introduced by a Conservative government, but actually passed by a Labour government, obviously, because it's something they wanted to carry forward for the good. And indeed, it's interesting that Ted Heath at the time was actually reported at the time of saying in private messages you read back in history that I actually could not afford another disaster, and football or crowd safety had to be subject at that time to the law. And his view at the time was that if a club couldn't afford safety, they should actually go out of business. That was his driver. However, Wheatley realised that maybe the risk to smaller clubs going out of business was too great compared to the risk of an incident happening again, a crowd-related incident. So originally, when that Safety at Sports Grounds Act came in, it was only really for the English First Division and the higher leagues in Scotland, although it was actually introduced for the English Second Division at the time in 1979, which again caused quite a number of abnormalities in terms of crowds, because at the time we had Shrewsbury Town in the Second Division, who had 16,800 capacity, and they were subject to regulation. But then you had a massive club, Sheffield United, who are actually in the 3rd division, 44,000 who could get into Bramwell Lane at the time. And actually they weren't subject to the regulation. So again, you've got this disparity between. How did they pay for it? Well, they started having a levy on the ball. Spot on the ball, spot the ball. For anyone of a certain age like me, remember when my dad used to let me take the coupon down, having put the X's as to where with the ball, so that we could all, maybe win some money. And that's how it is paid, as opposed to the betting firms paying tax on. We then move on to Valley Parade, and again, 1985, 11th of May. 56 people lost their lives going to a football game. 44 were from Bradford. There were 2 Lincoln City fans. We then had the committed inquiry into crowd safety and crowd control at sports grounds, the Popplewell inquiry, which really then led on to the Fire Safety and Safety of Places at Sport Act in 1987, really. And it was interesting that game was supposed to be a celebration. Bradford City had won promotion as champions from the 3rd division up to the 2nd division, and had obviously the legislation been accessible or applicable, to the 3rd division at the time, then potentially that inquiry or that incident, or that dreadful incident, would not have occurred. Obviously, and just a matter of aside, the bottom picture there is Lord Popplewell visiting one of the turnstiles. If they talk that Burnden Park was quite a forgotten incident, then really, unfortunately, the events of St Andrews on May 11th, 1985 are probably, forgotten in history as well. It was described as more like the Battle of Agincourt. Leeds United were away to Birmingham City. Both clubs had a history of violence. One person died at that game. And it's almost, for me, maybe a regret and tragedy that when we look and we remember people in the past, and we quite rightly remember, Hillsborough and the Bradford fire. Very little is made of a 15-year-old boy called Ian Ambridge, who simply went to watch a football game, got separated from his friend, and died 48 hours after the game in hospital from serious head injuries when a wall fell on him at the game. So it's quite tragic, really. And that, at around the times where the Popplewell inquiry was happening as well. And then we move on to Heysel. And I mention Heysel really because although this presentation we're looking at the English divisions or the English League really, first of all, obviously that really affected the Popplewell report as well. 1985, Liverpool against Juventus in the European Cup final. 29th of May, 39 people died, over 500 injured, and some convictions. Quite interesting, again, shocking. The game went on an hour and a half, 90 minutes after this. I remember sitting there watching the game, with my mum, a fanatical Liverpool fan at the time, really, on our rented DR television at the time, thinking then, how can this possibly go on? But this is where you're starting to get a blur between crowd safety and hooliganism, because there was an editorial 2 weeks before this in the Sunday Times where they actually described football fans as slum football as a slum sport played in slum stadiums with an ever increasing slum set of supporters. So you were starting to get that. And what's quite interesting as well, as we move on to barriers, is that the day after this, the Deputy Chief of the London Fire Brigade, Jerry Clarkson, was actually dispatched to the ground to do a structure report, and he actually came back that it was actually unfit for purpose. really the walls, the supporting pillars on the walls were actually the wrong way around, and a lot of exposure on the barriers. So that the barriers that you can see in the picture could only take a moderate force. And just while we're at it, and we talk about barriers, if we're actually looking at loading now, in the green guide, if we're looking, a wall really should be taking between 2 or 3 kilonewtons per metre at a height of 1.1 metres. Or if you go up to 2.5 metres high, then it only has to take 1 kilonewton per metre. But, there's all these testings that obviously I'm sure my colleagues, who are listening in will be aware of. We then go on to Hillsborough, so I'll just go back to the Popplewell report, sorry. Popplewell, again, quick little bit about this politics. The fact it was all joined together caused some dismay, those 3 events. Gerald Kaufman, quite a famous Labour MP at the time, actually said that it was actually not only insensitive, but it was in the worst possible taste, because there was this merger and potential this confusion between crowd safety and hooliganism. And then you have a Conservative MP with the protection of Parliament saying at the time, going back in relation to the Bradford fire, that police officers actually plunged themselves into the crowd to pull fans out to safety, who would all ordinarily have been pelting them with rocks on another day. So we start to get this mix between safety and hooliganism. Popplewell wanted to suggest increased stewards training, stewards handbook, and an annual review by the local authority. Sorry, we're going the wrong way. We can tell it's live. Hillsborough, obviously, has been spoken about. 15th of April, 1989, 96 people lost their lives, which led to the Taylor report. Now, I remember being a young PC at Wembley for the cup final in 1989, which obviously at the time, for those of you who aren't aware of history, was the Merseyside Cup final. Liverpool actually played Everton. Really quite fitting if we could celebrate football really at a time when people have lost their lives. Liverpool actually won the game, which is probably quite a fitting tribute. The problem that that Taylor mentioned, was actually the 9th report. I've mentioned a few. We had Shaw in 1924. We've had Chester in 1966, Harrington in 1968, Lang in 1969. Had the Wheatley report in 72. McElthorne was in 1976. We've then had the Department of Environment did a report in 1984. We've then had Popplewell, we've then had Taylor, and we still, unfortunately, can't make stadiums safe, which is quite a damning indictment, really, in my own personal opinion. Taylor obviously brought in all-seater stadia, which came in as a result of the Football Spectators Act in 1989, that review. And then you've got the Football Spectator Seating Order, which can be updated, which we'll go into. Really looking on from Taylor, independent, National Inspectorate, independent reviews. Barriers should be tested every year. Again, we'll look at that later in the presentation. Formation really of SAGs, bringing on your police, your ambulance, your fire, your local authority in terms of building control. So we've got those strength of those walls, flow rates, again, and CCTV, something that Popplewell had mentioned as well, about flow rates and CCTV. And again, if you go back to Popplewell and the Bradford fire, not only had Shaw mentioned it in 1924 about having safe access onto the pitch, and there would have been crushings back in 1924. But even Popplewell noted that after his report into the fire, that there should be safe access onto a pitch in grounds should there be a fire. And this is 2 years before Hillsborough. So where do we stand legally in terms, and I'll move on to that. What I've done really here, the legality really was what affected a lot of my thinking in terms of not only learning from the lessons of past to make hopefully anything I was involved in and colleagues safer, was in fact, where do we stand legally? And it's not because I was some kind of ex-cop, etc. But I think one of the benefits of actually studying crowd management at Bucks University really was actually having the law input there. And we were very fortunate to have an input from a gentleman called Ben Chalice, who's actually quite well known in the sort of live music, etc. He's done, you know, live aid and those types of things in terms of the legalities. And he gave us some really interesting presentations. The one that really struck in my mind, really, and again, this is where the slides have been slightly thrown out, was the Occupiers Liability Act. And as it quite says there, the common duty of care is a duty to take such care and reasonable in all the circumstances that the visitor will be reasonably safe to the premises for the purpose for which they are invited or permitted by the occupier. So as a safety officer, if someone's being invited into a ground, we have to make sure they're safe because they are being watched in or invited in to watch football. Likewise, those of you that do green fields or maybe take over stadiums, or some of those event students that are out there. If you're putting on an event anywhere, or you're maybe inviting someone into a shopping centre for a book signing, you know, the Occupiers Liability Act is going to apply for you. For those of you that may be quite interested in further reading, there's really a stated case from the House of Commons, comes from 1966, and it's Wheat against Laken. And really what that's telling us, it's one of control in terms, that's the test, is one of control. And the really good analogy that Ben Chalice used that really stuck with me forever was the fact is that if you have a temporary stand anywhere that collapses, the people with control are fourfold and can be questioned. You've got the site owner, you've got the promoter of the event, you have got the provider of the seating, and you have got the safety or security company that were looking after that seating. They have all technically, and could certainly be questions in terms of they have got control of that. And you can go back and it all comes from that stated case, Wheat against Laken. Health and Safety at Work Act, I think we're all aware of that, but it does, again, affect my thinking. Safety at Sports Grounds Act 1975. This is where it started to set out the requirements for a safety certificate, the power for a local authority to issue a safety certificate, confirm that the sports grounds are safe. And then the Secretary of State can designate any sports ground accommodation of more than 10,000 spectators or 5,000 in terms of the high big end football as requiring a safety certificate. Mentioned really coming out of the Bradford fire was the Fire Safety in Place of Sports Act 1987. Obviously, we're basically stands that take more than 500 people. So you can read this for yourselves at leisure. Again, when this was designed, it was really for, you know, the student audience. Although I think we have got more than, I don't know, I haven't seen the poll reviews. Football Spectators Act, and this was really shaped my thinking in terms of safety. This is what really came out of Taylor, the Football Spectators Act. You know, most people would actually say, if you look at that Football Spectators Act, you're looking at pitch incursions, racial chanting, drinking in view of the pitch, football bans, either a 14A if they're on criminal conviction or a 14B if they're on civil conviction, in terms of the Football Spectators Act. But really what was key to me in terms of stadium safety was 10 and 11, where actually 10, they gave a license to spectators, but really 11, where we're talking about seated accommodation. So when I was working at Oxford United, I would have to comply with Section 11 of the Football Spectators Act 1989. Now, under a license, without getting too technical here, there are two types of license, and these should have all faded in to give me allowed to speak. You can have compulsory, which is a license for the top two divisions of English football, i.e. the Premier League and the Championship. Or you can have a voluntary all-seater order, which Oxford United were subject to, because when I started the Oxrails project, they were not in the top 2 divisions, although they had been. So a compulsory order, access has got to be required when requested for anybody with a duty to inspect, SAG, SGSA. Compulsory, only seated accommodation shall be provided for spectators at a designated match, and spectators shall only be admitted to watch a designated match from seated accommodation. So you have to have seating. This is where rail seating's fallen down, because if you lock it, you haven't got a seat. If you lock it, you haven't got a seat, because the flip can't flip. It's locked up, so you're forcing people to stand. Voluntary is what Oxford United was subject to, really, where we just had to say if we were going to change it, we had to get written permission. Corporate manslaughter, I always bring this one in, really, and to finish off the legality, really. Obviously, probably if Hillsborough had happened or a similar event in modern time, then this probably would have been the event or the legislation that potentially would have been brought about against one or more of the participants who had a responsibility. So it's an offence where we're going to manage and organise a person's death amounts to a gross breach from the duty of care. And it's really looking at a failure by the senior management. And what we've really got there is it's really the second paragraph, really. Senior management in relation to the organisation are persons who've played significant roles in decision-making, whole or substantial parts of the activities. So again, when I was speaking to people at Oxford United, really, you know, it is not only really the safety officers responsible. There are other people really who could be responsible should an incident occur. And we're not talking just about incidents from any incident in a stand, etc. We are talking, the fact is that, you know, it's the senior management. But don't shy away from this. And this is where it comes back to, you know, not only having skills and experience, but those qualifications. The safety officer is a key decision maker. And although I'm not here to sell any product, really, for me, in terms of self-development, which is a little bit now, a level 4 spectator safety, for those of you that may not have been involved in key decision making, I would say is absolutely vital. It's that sort of top of the pile, really, in terms of where are you making that effective decision in terms of the NVQ and diploma. And I'm not saying that organisations that offer level 5s in various crowd sciences, they are and do offer excellent value, but you can't get away from the fact is that a lot of people will go, have you got a qualified safety officer at your event? So where do we stand in terms of the Green Guide? And this was giving my thinking. Again, really, we're looking at students here for this, but the safety of spectators management responsibility extends to all people present in the ground, including members of sports staff, subcontractors, media personnel, medical providers, and also the players' safety, athletes and event officials in all aspects other than injuries sustained of a sporting activity. So we'll make sure that we don't have a debate about COVID-19 here, but clearly there is a requirement potentially there that a safety officer should be involved. Again, looking at event for students, really, any event at a sports ground, whether it relates to sport, entertainment, or any form of gathering to which the public is admitted, really is covered by the Green Guide. Now, the safe capacity of a sports ground, again, we have to have some assumption of knowledge here, is that it's going to take a part of the physical factors, the P factors, and the safety management, the S factor, really. So we have to have an assumption of knowledge here, again, from the audience. And again, because this talk really was only about safer standing in seated areas, really, I've only really gone just to remind us that the holding capacity was the number of usable seats times either the lower factor of either the S or the P. And again, we had to have some assumption of knowledge here. So yeah, apologies for people that may or may not be keeping up. So where did this come from? Well, obviously, being a safety officer, like a lot of my colleagues, there was this issue of persistent standing, which, if you read back, I don't really think that the authorities thought that people would stand in seated areas. That there is a school of thought that had they thought it, then it would have been included as a recommendation of Taylor and in the Football Spectators Act. Because actually standing up in a football ground persistently is not actually a criminal offence, for those of you that may not be from the football world. It's actually breach of the ground regulations, Regulation 13, but it's not a criminal offence. So I was left with trying to manage persistent standing, as were a lot of my colleagues across the country. So we have persistent standing, really, where persistent standing, again, people stand up in a seated area, not just in moments of excitement, but really continually. Now, that in itself presents a hazard. The hazard being the persistently standing crowd. The risk is they could topple over from top to the bottom. Now, the Green Guide, and again, I make no apologies, it's not a typo, but at the time we were doing this, we were working off the 5th edition of the Green Guide. Hence, in fact, it's 2008, not 2018. So these were the references that we were working off at the time. You know, the Green Guide had said that the maximum rake angle for standing terraces was 25 degrees, and the maximum degree of rake for a seated area was 34 degrees. For those of you that may not be familiar, and again, apologies for assuming knowledge, the rake angle is that one. It's the distance. Obviously, that's the step. That is where the players, the spectators stand. Your rake angle is that one there. So we had there at the time Oxford United, because I went round and did all of them on my hands and knees, and also are using measurements and an inclinometer on my iPhone to get it right. The degrees went between sort of 27 and 28 and a half, around that. So again, we'd gone beyond the maximum rake for a standing terrace. One of the reasons we looked at is that people stood up, or why people stood up, because we'd asked them to sit down. 2011, there's 3 guys who looked at safety in football stadia and wrote an academic paper, Melrose, Hampton and Manu. And they asked a number of people really as to, well, why do you stand up? Not only in terms of people from licensing and terms involved in stadium safety, but also football supporters. And they came up with a variety of reasons. Atmosphere. Some people said, well, because we want to and we disobey, etc. And it was sometimes, you know, things like the weather. You know, you can read this for yourself. Preferences. People prefer to stand and sit. So there wasn't just one single reason that really we could, you know, deal with one particular item to actually get people to sit down. And when you actually now go back to the Green Guide, and that about I've got a responsibility for safety, you know, sometimes, and it's mentioned in a lot of reports that have been mentioned. Actually sending a steward into a crowd to take someone out may be inherently dangerous for them, because I've got a duty of care for them. Also, as well, it says in the Green Guide, I've got to be responsible for their safety, let alone any primary legislation. But also, as well, as my safety officer colleagues who are listening will probably know, as soon as you grab one up, someone else will probably just stand up just for the hell of it, if I might use that term on a PowerPoint. So again, these should have flowed in. So what I did was, actually, if you actually look at, and again, it's, you know, gone around a lot with COVID-19, but really, again, you know, for me, and it's about that continual development. You know, I'd done crowd control, I'd done the crowd management degrees, really, and then I'd done the level 4 back down from the level 5 and the level 6, really. But then really I started sort of looking at health and safety legislation or qualifications that I'm going through now. You look around, and one of the things that really stuck out was there was this, you know, thing called the hierarchy of control, which really we started to apply to stadium safety in terms of, well, could we eliminate the crowd? Well, yeah, that could quite easily be eliminated because if you didn't get a grip of it, you know, the safety advisory group can put conditions on your safety certificate. They could reduce the S factor, thus reducing the capacity in the area. So yes, we could eliminate it because obviously they can put conditions on it. A license issued by the SGSA, you can only have a license or not have a license. You can't have a conditional license. Substitution, we've only seen the substitute crowd now really with sort of cardboard dummies and faces because of trying to give some access to COVID-19. So we couldn't really substitute a crowd. So we actually went down the hierarchy of control. Could we really look at an engineering control? And we probably could. Because we tried administration. We had tried ticketing messages. We had tried, what had we tried? What am I looking for? Internet messaging. You know, we've spoken to fan groups. You know, we've got every turnstile operator to ask people, please, when you come in, can you sit down, etc. And all these had really failed. And obviously PPE was not really suitable. So the solution was really an engineering control because the only alternative we had was to get crowds to sit down. Well, we'd failed. Clubs across the country had failed for that. I documented evidence I'd failed. Ejections, we couldn't really eject because then you start getting that animosity between the supporter and the steward, and then you start getting that crowd psychology that even if they weren't together, well, they were going to be because you're not taking one of us from this crowd. We won't let it happen. We could look at the capacity again being reduced, or we could look at the licensing issues. So really, the only alternative really was to go for some kind of engineered control. Excuse me. These actually caused me some problems as well because you had rail seating, which obviously West Bromwich Albion had tried to get through in late 2017. Wasn't allowed in England in the top two divisions because then it wouldn't become seated accommodation because when the lock was on, it wasn't a seat. So picture really in the middle there is Celtic Park, where they've actually got something like 2,950 seats, which have got rail seating. And then the one on the left is Shrewsbury Town, who actually put 550 seats into their ground, rail seating. Again, they weren't actually in the top two divisions, so they were allowed with SGSA and SAG approval. But had they been promoted, they would have 3 years to either take them out or for the legislation to change, because Shrewsbury Town hadn't been in the top two divisions of English football at the time that the legislation had gone through. The problem I had at Oxford United was the fact is that they'd been in the top two divisions, you know, back in and around maybe after, you know, the Maxwell days when Maxwell was chairman. They even won a cup once and would have been in Europe, but for the European ban that emanated out of Heysel. And the problem is once you've had an all-seater stadium in the top two divisions, if you dropped down, you had to keep it. But if you went straight back up, you weren't given the 3 years leeway in which to make your ground match fit, as it were. So those barriers potentially that we were going to put in, if we didn't get permission, would had to have been taken out immediately at a great cost. I'll talk about loadings in a minute. So I couldn't really use rail seating. So October 2017, we were walking around the ground, Martin Gerben and I from the SGSA, and I'd already had a view or a request from Oxford United, a section of supporters called the Ultras, who wanted a singing area and flag waving area, very much like Crystal Palace were doing, but I think they wanted to replicate the Berlin Wall. I don't mean obviously the Berlin Wall, the Berlin Yellow Wall that you see with the can. So So they wanted some kind of barriers where they could hang flags, etc. So it got thinking, and we were actually and talking about it, and I'd had plans to put trying to get permission to put a barrier, but they were going to move here, there, and everywhere. So in the end, it sort of came up with, well, why don't you put a barrier everywhere across the whole section? And I went, oh, can we do that? And then we sort of discussions happened, and we'd already actually had at the time a Type 7 barrier, which for those of you that are familiar with the Green Guide, actually was 800 millimeters high, a load bearing of 1.5 kilonewtons per meter. But it also, as well, as long as that was within 530 millimeters of a seat, that's what was in the Green Guide at the time. So there was already a precedent really for barrier in front of the seat. Just I don't think the government were really expecting what we're about to do. So the one on the left is a sketch plan I did that night of, well, this is really what we want to do. That's from October 2017, when we still had the 5th edition of the Green Guide. A sketch I did in one of my notebooks as to, this is what I wanted, and this is, well, Mark says he's got a presentation sort of coming up with some outspoken people. I tend to think this is what I want, this is what I was going to get, but I didn't realise how difficult that journey was going to be. The one on the right really is another sketch I did showing a difference between a rail seat and the barrier seat. The barrier seat, obviously picture 2, has got a loading of 1.5 kilonewtons per meter. That is because the only risk there you've got, theoretical risk is the load on the barrier. The rail seating or rail seating, as was seats with barriers, barrier seating is now, that's got a loading of 2.5 kilonewtons per meter. The reason that has to be higher is you've got a theoretical load of an increased risk of an increased load, because you've not only got the person sitting on the seat, but you've also got the person, as is quite eloquent in my diagram there, either with their feet up, kicking it forward, like some southern people do in a cinema when we could go, or unfortunately just standing there and pushing it. So whereas with the single barrier, you actually only had one force, and that was the force of the person behind. Because the barrier was independent of the seat, the person sitting on the seat was not actually putting any weight on the barrier. So that is why you have a less loading for independent rails as opposed to rail seating. Hopefully I'm not losing anybody. I've come out, Mark. Is that the end? No, I'm back in. Sorry. So what we then had is that is a design there that really we told the SGSA what we were intending to do in 2017, and had many discussions with Martin Gervin. DCMS were also aware that a club was going to do it, but they weren't aware it was Oxford United. So we had these engineering plans drawn up in and around late 2017, early 2018. Again, we're still on the 5th version of the Green Guide at this stage, folks. And just for those people that are interested in technical stuff, the loading we'd had, obviously 1.5 kilonewtons you had to take. We'd gone for 900 mil high, really because of sight lines. There's some dimensions there of the barrier tubing. Also M10 and M12, for those techies out there, obviously recognise that that's the size of a countersunk screw. And we had key clamp connectors just to the ends of the barriers. So what we then had is we then did lots of test builds. That's my head, because rather like a high jump rail in the top left, we actually had one where we were moving the barrier up and down, because the legislation or what we were going on, we could go between 800 mil and 900 mil. What was best, not only for sight lines, but for customer and supporter, the sort of comfort. Obviously, the one in the middle, we actually, the one with the tape measure, we actually had to change the feet because nothing against the strength of the concrete, but sometimes when you put the load on, we had to redesign the feet to make them more of a, because we couldn't go for a square because they would pop out and potentially cause a trip hazard. I was trying to minimise all risk. So we actually had to go for a rectangular type, in the end, a rectangular type base plate. And in the end, as you see in the picture, what we did there with the picture underneath test bill, we actually turned them round, the key clamps, so that people then maybe couldn't undo them during the game. So an awful lot of work went into that, really. You know, so I say just in some timelines, we'd in January 2018, we'd had to show our hand to DCMS and say, you know, this is it, Oxford United, and we'd written repeatedly to DCMS via the SGSA. So there was a lot of, I'd say, indirect contact, because SGSA were sending messages up and asking messages on our behalf. And I was really losing faith with actually not getting an answer. So I thought I'll be clever, because we'd had the barriers sort of built. We had the barriers built in and around June, that type of thing. And I'd written to DCMS saying, can I have an answer as to whether they would be allowed in the championship, so we couldn't rip them out. This was in and around April 2018, and they weren't getting back to me. So I thought I'd try and be smart, and I asked them a series of questions, because I think police officers amongst the audience will realise you can have open questions or closed questions. Closed questions being where they can simply say yes or no. So I thought I'd try and be clever. So I wrote to the SGSA asking for a reply for DCMS. I wanted a response within 4 days. I said, right, they've got 4 days. I want these questions answered. And it was a simple yes or no, because we were having this sort of standing joke. You know, when is a seat not a seat, or when it's got a barrier in front of it? Well, it was a seat last week. Why is it not a seat now that I've got a barrier in front of it that's not actually connected to it? However, and I will have to look down here because I want to make sure I get the quote right, because I would never want to misquote the government. The letter I actually got back said, in answer to my simple yes or no, can I have a barrier? Does it comply with Section 11 of the Football Spectators Act? Was no guarantee of decision could be given in relation to a hypothetical situation which may or may not arise at some future time. So that was the answer, unfortunately, to my simple yes or no. So as well as while this was going on, was also having some issues with the police. And when I say the police, I mean the UK football policing unit, who I'd actually done some work for back in my football days of doing ports operations whilst being a football spotter. In terms of, they thought that the clarity of CCT images was reduced when a person stood as opposed to when a person was seated. So the argument I actually had is that there's another example there of the innovation we were doing. We had an Oxtails app. I had a GDP PR compliant discrete scheme for listing football bans and acceptable behaviour contracts, etc., which we could pass to club, which was actually sort of again, some sections of the fan base were not, didn't make myself too popular with them, but it certainly made it safer. So we'd actually had Oxtails, as it was there, supporting safer stadia, and then we were having Oxrails supporting safer spectators. In fact, so political was it that actually Oxrails supporting safer spectators is what we had to call it. I actually was, and still to this day, wanted to go to Oxrails supporting safer standing, but I wasn't allowed. And I wasn't encouraging standing. I mean, and the problems I was just going back to the images of Shrewsbury Town and Celtic is that they were 5% of their grounds. We'd actually mapped out over six months hazard and risk of people standing at different times. So obviously the hazard was the people standing, the risk that they would fall. But when they weren't in there, in the ground, there was no risk. So what we actually did, we mapped hazard and risk over time, over 6 months, from gates opening to sort of half time. And it wasn't difficult really, because all you really have to do to map hazard and risk over time was get almost like when you book theatre tickets or cinema tickets and you put a little cross, or your airline seats. And all we did was put a cross every 15 minutes where people were seated or standing. So you could actually map out where your risk was, both home and away. And actually what we mapped out was 17.6% of the fans inside the ground stood on a regular basis. And the problem we had again from Shrewsbury and Celtic, and this was taken up by a number of politicians, was the fact is that, well, we were giving them 5% of the seats could be converted to standing. Yeah, well, that's not really right, because why are you only dealing with 5% of the risk? You should be dealing with all of the risk. So I was going to put 100% of seating in where 17.6% of people stood on a regular basis, because you have to mitigate the risk to make the stadium safer. So this, again, percentage of people standing up was getting quite difficult and quite confusing. Say standing again, so hopefully the argument I had, and the difficulties again of politics at the time, is at the time we were having this debate, was there was unfortunate comments made in the House of Parliament that racist behaviour increased in a football stadium when a person was standing as opposed to when they were seated. Again, there was no correlation between that. And also as well, there was the unfortunate incident of Wigan against Manchester City in the FA Cup, where there was the pitch incursion, again, purely because there was no crowd management plan, potentially, where they'd have been allowed to come onto the pitch. Again, that wasn't down to the fact that people were standing in the stands. But again, that was taken on by some people as to a reason why maybe we should put up a negative. So we had to counter the CCTV images, and they were clearer. So we won that battle. We then had the issue of a width of supporter. Now, I'm sure everyone's happy about or aware of Keith Steele's, the overview models you can get. And when we look at a human from above, they're rectangular as opposed to. So there was a very sort of influential, and it was really good at it on its time, paper written in 2013 by the SGSA, where basically there were some control measures put in. Because really what they were saying was the width of a seated supporter was 460 mil, but the width of a standing supporter was 550 mil. The influence being that if all the people in the row stood up, they would pop out of the ends and thus block the gangways, which we didn't really want, because Short had written about it, Taylor had written about it, everybody had written about it, and we all knew it was dangerous, blocking the stairways. So there, what we actually had to prove time and time again is that people do not stand shoulder to shoulder. So obviously on the left is seated, on the right is where you do get that little bit of jostling in the crowd, really. So no one was really poking out into a barrier. And then if you go back to, what Mick Upton had written about in Back to the Colosseum, if you have an effective ushering system, crowd management system to get people into their seats, same as it did back in the day when I used to go to the cinema in Uxbridge at the Regal Cinema, and before they sold me the ice creams, there was someone who actually said, that is where you sit. You don't find it for yourself, you actually sit there. So really, what we had to introduce across all over the stand really was an effective ushering system across all over the ground, because we'd had a problem with people not standing in the ground, not of standing in the stairways when I took over. And providing you have enough stewards, ushers, we some at the times, it was cost effective because we didn't get affected by the S factor and anything, because we actually had at times, whilst we were loading the stands, 5 or 6 people on a stairwell, actually with 2 or 3 stairs each. You go that way, you go that way. That's where you sit. Again, really quite, and it's quite good that those stewards are nice and identifiable, because in fact that was actually one of the reports from Short back in 19 1924, actually, there should be identifiable stewards. You know, actually, if you look at his report from 1924, you could almost replicate loads of it into the 6th edition of the Green Guide. So we then had a visual guide. Now, I'll credit Martin Gervin for this. Actually, what we did was not you must stand between that in some kind of almost like social distancing measure in this sort of COVID era, but really just to give people a general idea. They didn't have to keep turning their back to actually to find out where they were sitting. And we actually found over a period of time that actually no one really poked out into the aisle. And what we did really as a management is actually we only sold, in rows of 25, we only sold 20 season tickets. So, and the rest were pay on the day. So then if we did have to put a control, or we were told to do by the SAG, we could actually put the reduction in there and no one would think, hang on a minute, I've lost my season ticket. So the only season tickets were the 20 in the middle, really. So that actually, again, we proved, and we had to prove. I know for a lot of crowd managers out there, you think, well, this is actually quite a simple thing. But, you know, you're looking at legislation. We had the 5th edition of the Green Guide, and politicians are really, really homing in on this and saying, hang on, it's written down here. You know, so we had some interesting sort of battles where we actually, and let's just prove this theory. You know, this theory works. I lost me way there. One of the things as well, really, so we moved on. June 2018, there was the Westminster Hall debate on safe standing, which really was almost a turning point, which then led on to the rapid review. You know, the rails first went live against Fleetwood in 2018. In February 2019, that they got SAG report and we passed, which is quite interesting. So we were happy with that, and they were actually we then got the letter saying they would be allowed in the championship. How were they received by the emergency services? Really, really, really well. I've got lots of pictures and lots of videos of the ambulance service doing practice in the rails, because we'd actually what's now created in the Green Guide now a Type 11 barrier, which is the independent barrier of seats. As long as you've got 305 mil minimum between the post and the seat, you can get in there. We had something like when we finished building 465 mil, so we were quite there. So they actually, and for them it was actually safer because they could even, once we could empty a row potentially, and they could deal with a casualty potentially whilst out without moving them, without the risk of a crowd falling on top. Fire brigade were really happy because it didn't really affect capacity. One of the things that came really out, and we again had to disprove, and we had to fight again, is because a lot of people were saying that some people would say that a barrier and a seat would mean you could increase capacity. So the control measures that the SGSA had actually put in 2013 in their document was a reduction of 1 in 6. Over 25. So over 25, you're probably looking at between 20 and 21 people if you had to put measurements in there, with reduction of 4 people. Some people on the continent and some people in the UK, some drivers for safe standing, actually picked on, well, actually the loading actually would increase. Potentially, you could actually get 1.4 people per seat if you have a barrier there. So actually then over 25 seats, you're actually looking at actually having 35 people standing a row. Something I've never ever agreed with. I don't think the SGSA or any SAG would ever agree with, because this is about safety, not increasing revenue. And Thames Valley Police, originally, you know, I think there was one comment that I maybe not have done enough administration in terms of trying to use persuasion, but really they came on board 100%. So we thank all the emergency services for that. So in summary, I say, and that's a picture there. You know, I was fortunate, honoured really, as we were trying to win this debate. That every year the SGSA board have a 2-day meeting and they go to various places around the country. You know, I was fortunate in October 2018 to give a very similar presentation about rails to them as we were trying to win this argument. As well as actually sort of, I say, at one stage, I think, because it was our local MPs at the time, Layla Moran, who was Liberal Democrat, Annalise Dodds, who's now Shadow Chancellor, You're very, very supportive of and using those sort of their time in that debate to try and push the Oxrail's argument. So one of the things that we really had to win, and the key learning points out of this, is that we timed, or I, really the safety officer. If you go back to corporate manslaughter, you know, I'd always remained a risk holder. And what I'd not done is I'd not created a safe standing area. I'd reacted to an existing problem that I couldn't deal with. Again, my own, and hats off to Tottenham Hotspur for doing it. But obviously they have put barrier seats in certain sections of the new stand. And hats off, or the new ground, and hats off and credibility to do them. From my own personal point of view, and its personal point of view, is that how do you know where you've put the seat? The barriers are the actual areas of the ground where your people are going to stand. It's just my own personal opinion. So we'd implemented an engineering control. We countered all the arguments. We gained both SAG and SGSA approval. And really, I think which really was the key, really, we'd actually remained an all-seater because we actually had no time had we ever touched a seat. All we'd done was put an independent barrier in them, which obviously in 6th version of the Green Guide came on to be a Type 11 barrier. So where do we stand? Best practice, really. I was really, really fortunate. 25th of July 2019, I got invited up by Wolverhampton Wanderers, Steve Sutton and Julie Ballinger, just to see, because they've really taken stadium safety to the next level. They had rail seats with built-in barriers in the Jack Hayward stand, and then, which, you know, really sort of almost like made my night, really. In the stand quadrant, they actually had seats with an independent barrier. You know, you can't patent a barrier, an independent barrier. If you did, I'd probably be a rich man. But there we are. Mark, I think you've got to change the slide. Seamless. So how can you not say this is not safe if you can hear me? This was what I took the night of the 25th of July. It's just one of many videos. I've got thousands of videos of seats and etc. But you know, I've got ones with more, you know, at times of more, you know, in action in terms of the crowd. But that language is, we say, a little bit fruity. So maybe it's best, but you just got the idea as to really how can that not be unsafe, and surely that must be safer for crowds who choose to persistently stand in a sliding area. So we had some simple ideas for safety, just really because we were looking at students, and I'll whiz through these. Knowing the game plan, a lot of people have been doing CPD in terms of ACT. You know, you take best practice from various places, really. The Know the Game plan is actually the ACT poster with the Oxford United colours in. I make no bones about that. I stole that from Aston Villa at Villa Park, who had one in claret and blue. You know, and provided there is no problem, providing you get that checked out by your local counter-terrorism security advisor, or I got mine checked out by Claire Worsley, who's the counter-terrorism security advisor, who's sort of linked into the FSOA, the Football Safety Officers Association. So as long as you've got sort of all like authority. 2017, we bought in clear bags to help try safety. You know, we stole that one from the NFL. We make no bones about that. This one I took from the London Stadium. We talk about psychology, making away fans feel welcome. West Ham were playing Crystal Palace. So in the away end, they actually had a guest ale from the local pubs in and around Selhurst Park, Crystal Palace's ground, and some welcoming T-shirts. The Eagle has landed. For those of you that aren't aware, Crystal Palace is called the Eagles. So again, you're working on the psychology of the crowd to really make them feel welcoming into that environment. You know, we haven't got home and away. We've got football supporters. Barriers, you if crowds don't get on, you can put a barrier in between them. I inherited this at my time of Oxford United, if crowds don't get on. So there we are. I think that Mark's got to go seamlessly into the other presentation, the other slide. Further safety measures. There's the one on the left is a ball stopping net behind a goal. I did some work at Lincoln City. The stands you can see there are actually called the Stacey West, which is a marvellous and lovely tribute, really. Stacey and West are the surnames of the two Lincoln City fans who unfortunately and tragically lost their lives in the Bradford fire. So that's quite a fitting tribute that they will never be, and nor should they, never be forgotten. And obviously, just one thing is that they're a defibrillator, which Wolverhampton Wanderers, who took safety to the next level by having seating for home and away, which we planned for, because if you've got a risk in home, then fans still turn up in away. So grounds must do something for the away as well. They've got a safety net. They've also got defibrillators. So where do we stand in barrier testing? I think it's me next as opposed to Mark. Mark's going to play this, I think. Are you? Yes.
They fell in their dozens. The collapse of a...
fell in their dozens.
So there,
the collapse of a...
We just had one barrier hold on, what's happened? We just had one barrier giving way. There's me. Oh, there we are. We're back with it. So really, the last part really is just general rules. And this, not only for safety officers, but really for those of you who may be more familiar with greenfield sites or coming to do events, within that stadium arena. If you look at the SGSA guidelines and going back from the Taylor report, when they're introduced in terms of barrier testing, there should be an annual inspection by a competent person with the appropriate skills and experience. You've got to keep a record, and the annual inspection is the visual one, and there's also a risk assessment done. Best practice would say that when your stewards or your chief stewards or your stand managers go out, they should really be checking on the condition of maybe one or two barriers within their stand or their area of responsibility. And again, when you're going back to do your 48-hour and your post-match and then your pre-match checks as a safety officer, again, you're looking for any type of visual damage. The competent person, appropriate person, skill and experience, you're sort of there looking at a chartered surveyor, structural engineer, people with those types of qualification. And again, if you're looking at best practice and it's not written in the green guide, what you should have is you should have every barrier should have its location, excuse me, and its number listed in your log. So what you should do as best practice over a 5-year cycle is you should test 20% of your barriers per year. 20% per year over 5 years is 100% of your barriers. Within that 20%, obviously you're going to have different types of barriers. So what you then do is you then test 10% of all barriers. So it's 20% of all your barriers. It's a minimum of 10% of each type of barrier. Should you get a failure of any one of those 10%, then you have to test 100% of that type of barrier that failed. Two parts of the cycle, really. You have a bedding in cycle and you have a proof cycle. Now, your barriers have got to pass both parts or both cycles. So you have an initial stage where what you do is you increase the load in 5 increments. And what you do is you take the measurement at each of those 5 loads and at the end and after removal. And what you're looking for is your recovery has got to be at least 75% from the original deflection from the original, or at least 2% or 2 millimeters, from the permanent. So Mark will now show how we apply a load seamlessly. And for those of you that remember car jacks back in the day, before all engines were repaired by computers, that is very similar to a car jack, where what you're doing is just pumping up the load. And the load is being applied through the blocks of wood so that you don't damage the barriers. What you're going to see now, straight away, because it's the way we had to work it, is another video. Watch about 10 seconds and you'll see the movement. So keep an eye on the barrier between the first and second blocks of wood.
It's going.
Yeah. It's going. You ready?
Yeah.
Ready? Yeah. You see it move there. That was the load being taken off. I don't know, can you play that again, Mark, in case anyone missed it? I don't know. Can we do that?
Light the camera. It's going.
Yeah. You ready?
Yeah.
Ready? Yeah. And there it moved when the load was being replaced. Thank you, Mark. I think we've got to let this run to the end because it's the only way that we can work. Right. So what you do, you then get onto the proof cycle, really, where again you have to run through this load or this proof cycle twice, 2 consecutive applications of load on 5 equal load increments. Now your final load has got to be 1.5 times the max or the load that it's got to take. So for those watched there, we'd created a type 11 barrier in the green guide. The loading is 1.5 kilonewtons per metre. The load you've actually got to put on is 1.5 times 1.2 to give you the load. And then what you're looking is you leave the final load on for 5 minutes. And you take the reading of each deflection and after each load, at the beginning of 5 minutes, at the end of 5 minutes. And if after and only after the second application, you've had at least 95% recovery on the deflection from the bedding in cycle, then you've passed your load. You passed your load. Your barrier has passed the load bearing. So that was a quick whistle-stop tour of barrier testing. Really, I had to do some credits. You know, I can sit here and spout all along, but this was not just about me. You know, I was fortunate to sort of be in the right place at the right time, and let's be honest, with the right skill set. But you know, sometimes having the right people around me. So you know, Martin Gerben did an awful lot of supportive work from afar. Richard Rockall, who was the chair of the SAG, Alex Alder from Accolade Measurements. Really, you know, without Darryl Hills and Ben Brown from Oxford United, who now runs Solihull Moors, when I actually went to them and I said, I've got this really wacky idea, and they went, not another one, because we'd gone through Oxtails and a GDPR conditions with, you know, either football supporters, a football association, or liberal-leaning people who used to go to Oxford University. So we'd had those discussions there already. So, you know, I had that. They thought, oh, not another idea. But in fairness to them, you know, they went with it. And obviously, you know, Noel McWilliams and Ben, who actually sort of financed this, you know, in and around in a time where we actually didn't know it was going to be ripped out. Oxtails really, you know, I just changed what was the system from Charlie Newman. You know, Steve Sutton and Julie Ballinger, who really, you know, were very hospitable when I went to Wolverhampton Wanderers back that time after I'd left Oxford. You know, and actually, you know, Wolverhampton Wanderers really taken it to another level in terms of safety for spectators, both home and away. And I think really, you know, fellow safety professionals really for, you know, thank you, you know, for all the learning over the time. There's a very interesting paper that came out of a book called, or a paper was written, it was called Heads in the Sand, which was really about football, politics and crowd disaster in the 21st century Britain. and that quoted the FLA, Football Licensing Authority, the forerunner really for the SGSA. And really what they said is that safety cannot be achieved by externally imposed regulations. It must be understood and believed by those who believe in it for themselves, those who actually deliver it, those responsible. So really I think it's down to all of us to make it safer. And really I probably want to thank most of all Helen, who's sitting next door listening to this, because when I was really banging my head against the sand sometimes in the wall going, why do they not believe this is a good idea? So thank you to her for keeping me going at those times and during my departure from Oxford. And then one final thing really, which is probably the worst photograph I ever took, but it's got the most important message. And it's from the National Football Museum in Manchester, where I stood and held a terrace and just thought quite deeply. I don't know if you can read it, but it actually said, complacency is the enemy of safety. And if you hold the terrace and you look out above that, and those words really have stuck with me for anything I've done, that complacency is really the enemy of safety. I don't think any of us can really afford to be complacent. And then there are some references, and they look like they're a different colour there, so they may have actually worked on the hyperlink. But there are references there for people that might want to read this further, and obviously various readings that didn't come into this. And also as well, because Mark was going to put it on some kind of social media, it was only right that the people that took the pictures, other than the majority that were mine, got the recognition for those photographic credits so that no one gets in any trouble. And there's my favourite football picture. I don't know if anyone's still listening after that, but wake up.
People are still listening, don't worry. Ian, thank you for that. That was great. A lot of people you'll see in the chat, if you get a chance to look at it now, a lot of people thanking you profusely, had to go to the meetings, things like that, but there's still a couple of hundred people in the room. And one of the main questions that came in was, do you have a reading list and stuff for people? So I think the references and the bibliography at the end of that might cover it. Or if you think that there is another list that you have, you could scribble down. We can put it in a Word or a PDF document and send it on to people too.
What I can do is I can check, because I've got lots of, going back to the things I've been involved in really in terms of crowds. I've got like from John Jury and Stout and people like that. And I've also got a lot of the reports. But whereas I've got the 5th edition of the Green Guide and I've got the 6th edition, but obviously you can't send the 6 out now because quite rightly they have to pay for it, etc. So I'd have to check. I mean, I'm quite willing to send a lot of these things out, but I got them as part of my studies, so I don't know if they're subject to that, and I wouldn't want to lose anybody any money, because the disaster one that was written by the guys I mentioned, Melrose, Hampton and Manu, that's free access, but a lot of the other stuff you've got to pay for. So I wouldn't want to do any academic out of money.
No, but I think what we could do, maybe even if it's just the list and let people go Google it and find it themselves. I think what people would like to be the name of the article or whatever, and they can go then and decide if they want to.
Most of this is in my head, which is probably a worry. I don't know, but really.
Well, you may need to just scribble it down roughly, and we can make it pretty and send it out to people. But no, I think you're right. I don't think anyone would want to be doing anyone out of any money on it or credit. But even if you had a list that people can go then and Google, and if they think something's interesting enough and they can pay for it, happy days. The thing is, there's been a lot.
To turn the computer off, it's getting hot. Hang on. It was on charge. I'm back. It's all right. We're live. There you go.
We're live. Here's there are a few questions that come in. Now, Ian, you'll see from looking at the chat before you log out yourself, there's been an awful lot of really good chat going back and forth with people, which, like we said at the start,
I haven't viewed the whole single thing, because, as I said to you before, if it pops up, my eyes would start going, because I've done most of this without notes, because we haven't got a presenter view in here either.
Yeah, no, listen, you'll see it. There's an awful lot of people having some fairly in-depth discussions on there. A couple of questions that we spotted along the way. Just in relation to the CCTV and whether standing versus sitting was giving a less quality picture. Graham made the point, would the clarity of the picture not be based more on the equipment versus whether people are standing or seating? We've all seen good cameras and bad cameras. Like, people couldn't really understand logically how
you've got to remember as well that at the time I was having to disprove every argument that was being thrown up, because it was the word groundbreaking is it's not groundbreaking because it's not medical research or anything like that. But when you're actually sort of at the forefront, or you're trying to do something first, you've almost got to disprove every argument. The great thing about academia and like that is I could debate all long. You know, I'm not particularly. I'm not saying everything I say is right, you know, but people listen to my argument and they could put up a counter view. Yeah. What happened then is that, particularly at the time, I can't really mention any names of the people that I spoke to at the UK football policing unit, because I know some of them from working with them in the past. I know some people have changed, but they were almost representing what was the thinking at the time. Now, I say that happened at the time of the disorder for Wigan, Manchester City, and there was a gentleman, well, there's still a gentleman called Mark Roberts, who's quite high up in one of the Yorkshire polices, and he's the lead on football. And this is where a lot of this was coming from, in terms of, and politicians jumping on the bandwagon. Again, for me, it was illogical that with a decent CCTV system, and I didn't want to start branching off into what we'd done in terms of ox tails, but they couldn't win their argument against me, and some people in the background didn't like it because I disproved that, yes, it didn't make a blind bit of difference whether they were seated or whether they were standing. Because if you actually look, and I'll send it out to people, there's a case study about ox tails, and it just shows how many people that we actually convicted and got out through the identification of CCTV and then using the app whilst people were standing at times of disorder. And it's very interesting that people do stand at times of disorder. They don't sit down. I mean, safe standing was not a new thing. I could go on about this for hours. Jimmy Hill tried to bring in seated accommodation at the old Highfield Road in 1981 before Coventry went to the Ricoh Arena. Because he said even back in 1981, he said it's harder to be a hooligan sitting down than standing up.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
So, you know,
this is kind of more a question for me. I'm wondering the drive to do this and the drive to investigate this while you were at, I guess, at Oxford originally. Was that your personal drive that this could be done, and to just the logic wanting to prove it? Or was it an Oxford thing collectively there as an organisation? Did they really want to go this way?
No. Let's be quite blunt. It was a personal thing that I think then we convinced Oxford to come on board.
Right.
You know, but they, in fairness, they came on board. But the problem we had is because it was so secret. You know, other than you know, Martin Gervin and Richard Rockall and Helen. And at the time, Darryl and Ben, no one knew. So we've got the chairman and the financial controller and me knowing Oxford United. We've got my wife, and then we've got one member of the SGSA and one member of the SAG. I didn't tell the police. I didn't tell anybody because I didn't want a leak.
Right. So you had to keep it that tight.
It was that tight when we started. And this is why when the SGSA wrote to DCMS in late 2017, even then they wouldn't say it was Oxford United because it was getting so. It was whether it was my thing about being political. I don't know. I said, but you know, I still to this day wanted to call it supporting safer standing, and I was told no way in a month of Sundays would I get that through. Right. And indeed, on 2 occasions, whilst the SGSA came to Oxford for their annual conference, the conference that the SGSA hold where people can go to on the debate on safe standing, such was I would say the friction at the time, but I was actually told to pull out of that debate there was a debate of safe standing on the SGSA, but actually because the problems we were having, and I can't go into too much, not from the SGSA, but some of the responses that Oxford felt we were having from DCMS, I didn't actually go to that conference to take part in the debate. It would have put me in a difficult position.
Yeah.
And you talk about, you and you and Dan and other people, but trust me, I'll probably say it if
you were making waves too.
Yeah, making friends. Yeah.
But again, that's, I guess people will appreciate in general publicly. We understand there are political games afoot all the time, and when you're talking about something like this, which has the potential to polarize people's opinions, whether it's evidence-based or not, and politically, someone may have campaigned on something that now, if they were seen to be supporting this or acquiescing to this, maybe it causes them political strife. And that's before you get into just personalities. And I'm not putting words in your mouth, but no, I'm sure sometimes it's personalities too.
And I think the issue, really, and it's tragic, if you looked at, had we, nine, and it is absolutely tragic, 9 reports, including Taylor, to make sports ground safer. You've got Short in 1924 saying if there'd been a barrier at the side of the pitch, there would have been crushing. He says that in his report. And I think, and quite rightly, whilst I was annoyed, I think quite rightly there was some political nervousness because there hadn't been the closure for the families of the victims of Hillsborough. And that was still going on at the time of the Westminster, the Westminster Hall debate. And no one, I thought, do I put up a number of the amount of people that have died in football stadia? And it's no one should die going to watch a football game.
Yeah.
One person is too much, and we should have learnt the lessons by Hillsborough. And the reason I sort of wanted to come at this from a different angle, because people just sometimes say, oh yeah, we've had this event and X amount have died, is really actually is to try and maybe when it was going for students to actually influence. If you get an idea, get that, you be like the dog with a bone and follow it through, because you're not always going to be right, but let's change things for the better. And I think really, hopefully when the new normal returns, and hopefully if there's not a chase to the bottom that there invariably be with price, we might all carry on this harmonious, we're all in this together.
Well, that was actually a comment that did come in on the chat a couple of times, and often in the form of a question too, is there an inherent risk now that whenever we do get back to whatever the new normal is, that the reality is for the likes of the level 2s and the stewards and stuff that normally were available to work at football matches and stuff, a lot of them will have had to have gone elsewhere, found work elsewhere, and there could be a bigger skills gap than there was, which then may be filled by non-ACS accredited people and whatever, and there could be just an issue where it's just bodies, and we need to have people physically there to get going again, whether they're the right people or properly trained or experienced, could suffer. What do you think?
If you actually go back, I mean, even in one of the paragraphs of Short, he actually said, as well as stewards being identified, this is back in 1924, they should have some form of training. We've gone all the way through there. I'm not going to stand here and have the debate. I haven't got time about what's the right form of training. But I think there is inherent risk, because if football or any other spectator sport or anywhere else does start to come back, in terms of having those socially distanced managed spectators, some of our staff will have gone on to find other jobs through the necessity of having to feed their families. They'll still be at the shopping centres managing queues, at the garden centres, etc. So there's that inherent danger of not having enough staff. And even when you look now at, the fact is that, and I'm not an expert on security, Paul made a very eloquent speech, didn't he, in terms at the first one of these. Knows far more about SIA than me. But I understand from my readings around the perimeter of it that, the uptake of SIA is decreasing, in terms of people not giving up their badges. And those that take them up, there's probably about 80% actually want to go into the retail because you have a nicer working environment. and those 20% are actually fighting over, you know, or 20% are being fought over by greenfields and stadium. You know, and particularly now. I mean, and I'm not the first person. You know, I actually, and rules have got to change. I can speak openly because it's a matter of public record because it made the papers. But when the football seasons come out and the police look at it and they think, and they always have an inkling that before they publish the fixtures, there's always that risk of, you know, what's a risky fixture, etc. And I won't name the teams, but one particular August bank holiday or August around that time, we were due to play a particular team, and I knew that there would be trouble. And I said straight away, I will not be able to get enough stewards for this game, because if you're a steward, are you really going to want to work for 4.5 hours or 5 hours on a Saturday when you can go and do 5 18-hour days at a festival? I said straight away, and apparently a known lack of staff is not a reason to delay or change a kickoff. So we had to work round it through various means that I can't go into. Yeah, quite interesting, because I said earlier on, and it's interesting that a week later, when we still had festivals going on, I'd massively over-ordered, but I had a 63.7% wastage rate of staff not turning up. And that's the highest that anyone can remember. And I said, this is going to happen.
63% didn't show.
63% didn't show up. I was still above my safety. I was still above the number and safety certificate.
But that's how much you had to overbook, because you knew that.
I had to. That was the relationship I had with Richard Rockwell and Martin Gervin. Said, do you know what? I'm not going to hide the fact that I know there's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
This problem is coming over the hill.
I don't want you to get anyone in any trouble or anything, but I just want to cover that off again. You said that knowing a known shortfall in staff wasn't, for some people involved in this decision, obviously, wasn't enough of a reason to look at delaying a kickoff. It just wasn't entertained.
Not that's not a reason. Kickoff. Sorry, I said that. Not the change the kickoff time to an earlier kickoff. I do it
to an earlier. Sorry, yeah.
Or change the date. What you look at, it can be changed for policing risks. You know, those types of things. You know, etc. You can bring kickoffs forward, but then a lot of finance comes into it, Mark, without too much. Because if you bring a kickoff forward to a certain date or a certain time, the home team is responsible for the away team's hotel bills, etc.
See, there you go.
Cost starts coming into it. So again, when we have a whole review, actually look at what is the reasons. And again, you've got to look at, maybe there'll be less festivals now, but when you start looking at, have you got the available staff months in advance? So we were booking staff 2-3 months in advance in the end, because we had to, and really overbooking, knowing that we'd come in on numbers anyway.
And did you expect it to be, knowing, but still 60%, did you expect it to get near that high of a? No,
I mean, we knew we were going to be low, but then we were accentuated by breakdowns, bank holiday traffic, etc. So, you know, you're normally looking, because it does tend to move, but you can really be looking, you know, sometimes, and my colleagues out there will know, you know, I ended up, you know, most people would safely overbook. I don't know what it is in the greenfields. I would always book 15 to 20% over, and on key fixtures, I'd go higher. Okay. Well, that's that wastage.
Part of what you need to, Andrew asked a question. Are there any reports or statistics on injuries occurring from standing spectators in their seats in a grandstand?
No, because it tends to be the unwritten rule, because it's like that badge of honour that nobody really wants to admit that they've got some bruised shins or bruised knees. I mean, we have seen, there are videos on YouTube, as you see on the barrier going, or people falling over seats. There's quite a famous one, I think I put on LinkedIn, of the cricket catching and the person toppling over the seats. But in terms of, it's quite underreported. I mean, again, even if you look at those stadium that they get a license from the SGSA, there are 6 categories to get a license to operate a football stadium under the Football Spectators Act. You know, you've got to have a link of your S&P factors. They want to know about your safety, the training of your safety staff, your engineering examinations of the stadium. But the last section, which again is they take away the personal details, is you've got to have a risk of every medical incident that occurs inside the stadium, in terms of not only your staff being injured, but spectators being injured.
Yeah.
And every club has to provide that to the SGSA every sort of February or March, so that they can then get the license for the next season in June. And they are catalogued in there. But there is a massive underreporting. I mean, I took part in that government, and that's one of the things we'll send out at a later stage. There was a government sort of survey that came out of the Westminster Hall debate, standing in football, a rapid assessment of evidence that was done by people, I believe, at Leicestershire University or Leicester University. And even they couldn't actually find, because there are injuries, but what's sort of perceived and actual doesn't quite. But what happens is the risk has never gone away.
No, but of course not. Yeah,
Numbers now.
So Jessica asked, do you think the voice of God concept could help with any of these safety issues? Having a small safety message delivered by a player rather than a safety official. You know the way they do in concerts now, a big thing often is that the safety messaging. Yeah. Have you seen that done? Absolutely.
I mean, and we did actually think about it, because Oxford's, again, I'm showing my age here, but Oxford United's one of their most famous supporter was Timmy Mallet.
Okay.
People probably don't know. You look up Timmy Mallet. He was actually, shows how wacky and mad he is. He was Chris Evans' mentor. So you'll show where we're coming from. Yeah. And when you read Chris Evans' first edition of his autobiography. So we were actually going to have a safety message by, one of the problems that is quite difficult, and we had at an old-fashioned ground, is that on the TVs, we can't play the same message from the control room into every stand. They are the ground we were at, and it's no fault of Oxford United, and it's replicated across the country. They're independent tellies, controlled independently, and the financial outlay to sync all of our television sets, probably just to get that joint message out, as opposed to we could just turn it on to watch what the fans really want to watch. Sky Sports in the build up to the football. The
cost benefit didn't stack up really.
Absolutely.
All right, fair enough. There's a question. Catherine's wondering, the testing videos seem to show the barrier being pushed in a different direction to the direction the load will be placed on the barrier in normal use, and why is that? Now, there's someone who was paying attention. We talked about this. There you go.
Mention that until the end.
Why was it being pushed the opposite way to the logical way we thought it would be?
I just had, that was the video of the short content to show a test.
Okay.
Barriers should be, particularly pitch-side barriers, should be tested both ways.
Okay.
And this really, if you're a greenfield person coming into a stadium, what you should do is look at their barrier testing records. Because when you change the use of a football stadium or any stadium to its non-sporting event, first check that the safety certificate covers it. Because sometimes you might need a special safety certificate to cover the event. Because a safety certificate may only be issued for sport, or it may be issued for sport and add-on events that the SAG, Safety Advisory Group, are aware of. If you run an event without that event, that type of event being mentioned in the safety certificate, then you were in breach of the safety certificate. So this is why SAG liaison is quite vital. But then you actually go on to, as well as examining barrier records as a promoter, the crowd manager, whatever it might be, the barriers, particularly the ones at the pitch side, they have to take the load both ways. So and then and I'd recommend as well, it can be purchased. It's not yet been updated. But for those folk out there like you, Mark, if you look at the alternative use of sports grounds, which is a document about that thick by the SGSA, I'd recommend that people read that. But what you must do is if you test the barrier, because you're testing the load towards the pitch, well, that's fine when your crowd are in the stand.
Yeah.
But when your crowd are on the pitch, and people will argue with me and say, well, that's never going to happen. Well, we've listened to things in the past that have never going to happen.
Yeah.
You've actually got a theoretical risk then, other than 22 players or 11 players celebrating a goal, you've actually got a theoretical risk of a crowd on a pitch for a non-sporting event pushing the barrier the other way. So you have got a theoretical risk. So yes, well done. Was it Catherine?
Well spotted, Catherine. Yeah.
Noticing, but yes. That was
so
just one of my video. This is why when people say, "Oh, our barriers are being tested at a ground," it normally takes the firm around 3 to 4 days, because you're going back to 20. And I would always go for, although they really have to be checked every 5 years. Well, hang on a minute. They could potentially go wrong after a year, and you're leaving them for another 3 or 4 years. If you actually do some every year, you're also spreading in the cost. You're planning into your safety budget, and you're being open and honest, and actually saying, do you know what? We are actually being as open and as safe as we can.
Yeah, but I mean, I suppose that speaks to an overall safety culture in an organisation, as opposed to just doing the bare minimum to get their certificate, you know. Sorry, I'm just scanning through any other questions here. Are you going to do? Sorry, in the chat during your presentation, someone suggested that we do a general webinar specifically about COVID-19 and how it's going to affect all of these types of events. So someone's asking there, are we going to do one?
That might be a good idea, but as I've said all along, you know, I mean, and that's why I paid tribute to Mick Upton, you know, who's probably, and this is no disrespect to yourself, Mark, I mean, I'm not a letters after my name person, and an expert, you know, particularly maybe on LinkedIn, is a word too easily used. You know, Mick Upton was a world leader. So, yeah, but I think COVID-19 would be a good, for me, my own personal opinion, I think it'd be quite difficult to actually find who is an expert to talk about COVID-19. I mean, I'm happy talking about safe standing and barriers, and I'm quite happy talking on another occasion about GDPR and football fans, because that's my niche.
Yeah, I get you.
The rest of the world, I've sort of got that general overview, and it'd be wrong to say, hey, I'm an expert.
Yeah, I don't think anyone can really call themselves experts in COVID-19. I think the reality is those of us who work in risk and maybe are doing some work around it are applying what we already know, you know, the skills we have. And my thing, and again, maybe we will do a webinar on it, but it won't be billed as experts. It'll be billed as, look, here's what we think, here's what he thinks, here's what she thinks. Because it's changing too much, and it is a new thing. And for me, where I need to try and get people to with COVID, and again, this is a personal thing, is that it's just another risk. And I'm a bit like HVM barriers and stuff a few years ago. It can't take over everyone's thought process. It can't suddenly be the only thing we're thinking about. It's a risk. We consider it at the minute for a lot of reasons. It's a risk that's big enough that doesn't let a lot of things happen. But there'll come a time where the government will say, you can have your events, go risk assess it, do it properly. And then people are putting their heads on a block going, yes, it's another risk. We've considered it. There it is in my risk assessment. It's not the only thing.
It's another risk that, unfortunately, that can't be solved by PPE, which is at the bottom of the hierarchy of control. There's a lot of people who can't solely be solved by PPE.
Throw PPE at it.
Tell us.
It'll be fine. Just put PPE on everyone. They'll be fine.
Yeah.
There's a question, actually, that's a good question, Alistair. While these webinars are aimed at event professionals, Ian, specifically you, do you get involved at any stage in the design stage of a stadium? Have you been involved that early on? No.
If you actually look at that, I mean, and that's a very good. There are actually people that are involved. I mean, interestingly, going back to my degree, which caused so much furore at the time, really, with the dissertation in terms of the need for compulsory CPD for a safety officer. The reason that got me is that a safety officer, we won't go into too much now, but could just pop in, can't they, really? And I'm working towards my level 4. Someone somewhere says I've got an air of competency. Whereas you've actually looked, when I actually studied it, right going through, and this is what I did in my dissertation, from the very concept of a stadium being designed right through to every aspect of football, there had to be professionals with CPD. Builders had CPD, the designers, surveyors all had CPD. The really annoying thing that annoyed me is even when you get inside the ground, the Institute of Groundsmen or Groundship have CPD. The managers have CPD, compulsory, five hours a year. The referees have it. And yet here we are in the green guide. The person in overall charge of safety does not even need a qualification and doesn't need CPD. And they're the one that everyone looks to. Yeah. That cannot be right.
No.
I can see Ian Mixter's opinion and not any organisation that may be affiliated.
Yeah. No, well, you're preaching to the converted here. I think people know my feelings on CPG and upskilling and all of that.
Yes, because we met at the fire brigade, didn't we?
We did, during a very interesting week-long course, which was fascinating. But that and look, you know, to each their own. And when it's not compulsory, I get that some people are into learning and some people aren't. But you would have to wonder, with all those other elements in a stadium, just as examples, having compulsory CPD, how the people in charge of safety don't. It's fascinating. Lloyd,
just going back to one thing, there is that consultation with the Sports Ground Safety Authority, you know, so it's not that nobody with safety, you know, and obviously they, you know, they're made up of a pool of people with various skills, you know, ex-police, ex-building control, you know, and they're bringing in all that expertise. So I wouldn't want to think anyone that's new to the industry thinking, well, there's no input in safety at all into design. It's just, I don't really think safety officers really have that input. They are left, you know, to deal not with the consequences, because that's the wrong word, but they are left to, they have to play the hand they're dealt. Yeah. And let's be quite frank, the way the world is at the moment, nowadays they are dealt an exceptionally good hand by the SGSA.
Yeah, and no, I think that's a fair point, and it can get a little bit lost when the likes of you and me, bemoan the fact that, you know, there isn't compulsory CPD and stuff. The SGSA do a great job. Lloyd has come in with a very interesting operations question for you, and knowing Lloyd, it doesn't surprise me his brain went here. When you talk about the overbooking, because you know there's going to be that wastage and people who don't turn up, Lloyd is wondering, did you ever have more staff than you needed when you overbooked because more people turned up than you expected? And what, if any, was the impact on budget? I'm wondering what support there was from the top on the approach of overbooking to secure numbers and how it played out over an overall season. If you take a full season and you're hedging your bets overbooking, like, how does that, when you go to a meeting a few days after an event and you have to, or does this happen, you have to go in and say, look, we had 104% of what we needed because they showed and now we need to pay them. Is that something you run into, or how does that work?
I never had too many turn up.
Really?
Never, ever. You're always going to get, and you have to remember that, you know, and hats off to people that work in. I mean, I think whether it was the geographical location of Oxford United, you know, where I had students that maybe at Oxford University didn't particularly want to work as a steward on a football game. We had stewards from Oxford Brooks, and then we had lots of green fields around us, and an estate really where people wanted to come and watch the football, as was their right. Yeah. So in terms of the take up of locally based stewards, despite all the incentives in terms of, you know, reductions of tickets for friends, you know, money off in shops, you know, there wasn't the uptake. You know, if you look at some clubs, there's that massive draw, isn't there? Oxford still do so much for the community. And that was interesting, actually, that community involvement in clubs came out of the Popperwell report, really, to stop this non-distance thing. Yeah. Another aside. But anyway, so they did a massive amount for the community, as do clubs up and down the country. It's just Oxford, unfortunately, geographically, didn't really have. So we were relying a lot of the times on agency. So then we were having agencies coming, you know, 200-300 miles across the country to work at Oxford United because of the draw that we needed. So I think you were going to get some wasted in. So I never, ever had. I have to say, though, and I can put my hand on my heart here, Oxford United were 100% committed to safety. So I actually had, at times when I ended up as sort of go from head of crowd safety to operation director, I don't want to sound like a dictator here, but at times I had total control.
Yeah. But again, that's because, as you said, the boardroom, the C-suite, those people at the top, you reckon were fully bought into safety, and
I think and they were fully bought in with safety because I explained the legality. But if you come back to my very first comment about, and I'd people, the students out here, just to look at the trust equation and the trusted advisor. Yeah. Having that confidence, actually say, do you know what? We've actually got to listen to this bloke because actually he's saying it in quite a calm, methodical way. He's not getting all bullshit. He's actually saying, okay, but if you don't do
evidence
this,
for what he's,
please accept the risk. You're employing me to do a job. These are my recommendations. And in fairness to Oxford United, whether it was Daryl and Ben or whether it was Niall, I never ever had a no, you're not doing that because we are going to put price above safety. So I always overbooked because I knew from the history. And if I had overbooked, we live with it.
Yeah. But that's it. As you said, it's evidence-based.
And you've got to remember, just going back to Lloyd as well, we got to remember as well that I was at a time really where, because you have effective crowd management plans, if you manage a crowd, you don't have to control a crowd. So what I was actually doing was that during my tenure, the policing bill what sort of English is that? The policing bill was coming down.
Yeah.
So, it's not everything's going.
You're balancing it up. Yeah.
I mean, and they were very good. I mean, when I took over, we didn't even have, and it's again a matter of record, we didn't have enough. You go back to Short saying identified, and they're not the same. They're not the only club in the country. We didn't have enough yellow jackets to comply with the green guide, and they weren't numbered. So immediately, let's buy them. But actually, say, do you know what? When you explain it, say we comply with the green guide, but actually, we actually costed them over 5 years. So actually, the cost of a steward for a coat, which we got for the winter, and a bib, a waterproof coat and a bib for the summer, we had both. Actually worked out at 25 pence, and I can say this because I'm not delaying anything secret. Actually worked out about 25 pence per steward per game over 5 years, the life of a coat. So when you actually look at the cost like that, when I actually spoke to, it was Daryl and Ben at the time, and saying, you need to do this. And if we budget for it over 5 years, it's going to cost 25. If I go in and say, I'm going to cost, and I won't go into the detail, it cost £1,000 on a coat, they'll probably go, shit. So, sorry, no, you're not. But if I go, do you know what? I need some coats, and it's going to cost you 25p a steward. I mean, they were really supportive. I mean, I introduced for Oxford, we went above the living wage for stewards to try and encourage stewards. We didn't advertise it too much because I didn't want to pay £400 or £500 to become one of the companies on the living wage organisation, because I'd rather spend that £500 that would have cost us to join that organisation to pay some more.
Pay them stuff,
And my own personal preference, I'm not knocking what that fantastic organisation did, but I thought I've got better ways to spend 500 quid when I'm on a budget. Yeah, because we're not a Liverpool or a Man United or a Manchester City, but obviously they work within a budget. They just bigger budget.
Bigger one. There's just more zeros before the decimal point for them.
That's why at Oxford United we tried to solve problems with nets, clear bags, and bits of metal. Yeah,
but I mean, quite often, as we all know, whether it's Greenfield or Stadium, quite often creative solutions to things are born out of budget constraints. I mean, we all live in a real world of commercial sensitivities, and budgets exist, and hopefully, from a safety perspective, we can always get what we need. But at the end of the day, there generally aren't bottomless pits of money for everything. So you need to sometimes come at it, as you said, you need to come at these things the right way to make sense to the money people. So 25 cents per steward over 5 years per match is a lot sweeter than I need €27,000 tomorrow to buy jackets. You know
I mean, I say 110% Oxford United, whoever was at the helm, and whoever I dealt with were fully supported. Even going back to, and then this is a big clash, I know the SGSA like it, even, and if there's any marketing people left listening, they'll probably start melting now. But I had control over tickets.
They really liked you at Oxford, obviously, if they gave you control over tickets.
Because, I had control over ticketing policy in terms of numbers.
Okay.
Because, you've got that because if I'm going to manage it, I need to know what concessions you're giving. You know, what have we got kids?
How many free tickets?
Have we got, you know, these reductions? You know, and times where they'd say, yeah, but we could sell X amount to the away, take some seg netting away, and I can say fine, but what you'll gain with taking that seg netting away, putting fans, you may lose with extra costs of police, the knock-on effect for years to come when we have the disputes. Because if you have disorder at a football game, you're very likely in history, from when I was a police officer managing it or a crowd manager, you're very unlikely to get a reduction in police number for the next 2 years because there will be that nervousness.
Of course, yeah.
Well, it happened here. We've got intelligence.
Yeah, and it's hard to argue.
So if you actually say, well, actually, sell less tickets, but I'll make it safer for you, so you'll still make more money. I didn't come in and say, well, I'm in charge of tickets, we're going to do this. Yeah. There was always that reasoned argument, although it might come across sometimes as it's mixed as way or the highway. But no, there was always that reasoned argument. And you mentioned it quite well, cost v benefit. Yeah. You know, you may sell some tickets, but we're actually going to lose financially in the long run here. Yeah.
No, that's the real world we all live in. This has been a great session. It's probably the longest one we've done. And I was about to wrap it up, but Matt has come in with one last question. And I think I know the answer to this, but I'll put it to you anyway. Said, you spoke about testing all barriers of the same type if one of that type failed.
Yes.
So he's wondering, where does that strategy come from? Is it written in guidance or based on engineers' competence? I think that's within the guidance, isn't it? If you have a failure, you then have to check.
Yeah, you got to test it. I mean, what I'll do probably for the benefit. I mean, I know quite a few. I could tell you about, you know, diagram 14 would have to load, or figure 14 in Green Guide would have to load. Yeah. And then I think it's somewhere in chapter 11, 11.2, 11.1, something around that. There is what we'll do is when we send it out, we'll send it out. The best practice for the bedding cycle, 20%. Bedding cycle of the cycle, 20% per year over 5 years. That's not in the Green Guide. That comes from best practice in terms of the Engineers Act because you're testing them. Okay. Yeah. But actually, the 10%. If you have a failure of one type, how do you know there's not that subsequent fault? You apply that simple logic. That once, say, a car manufacturer, once they've discovered the fault on one car, this is why they recall all those. Don't say, well, let's just recall 10% of the cars because that will be good enough.
You need to do them all.
No, you bring them all back.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, there's a clear.
But mine, as Eden once said, my encyclopedic knowledge of things, which I don't think I've got, but acts and sections, I've lost it there. Probably hardest
I think
for 2.5 hours.
Most people will be happy enough that it's in the Green Guide somewhere for you to be trying to come up with the section and the paragraph. Don't worry, they can go and find it. Okay, look, for me, thank you very much. I think we still have nearly 200 people listening to this. So, I mean, obviously there's been value in this. People have enjoyed it. I hope they got what they thought they'd get. I mean, your experience in this area is exactly why you were the right person to cover the topic. And I think it's been borne out in the session. For us, my apologies again, it was slightly clunkier in the second half than it could have been. Like I said, Ian's presentation was a lot prettier than it looked for today. If you ever get the chance to see him in person, you might see the beautiful version of the presentation. But again, I think we got the message across and we engaged people in the conversation, which is what it's all about. We're back on Friday with the next one. In the offer section there, I've popped up a link to the rest of the webinars if anyone's interested in signing up. But you know where we are. Otherwise, this is the 5th one, I think. So we're about a quarter of the way through what we've scheduled. So we're making progress here. Ian, I hope you've enjoyed it. I know you put a lot of work into the presentation, and it's been probably 2.5 hours now at this stage. So thank you for that much time. I think people have gotten a lot out of it. If you read the chat before you log out, you'll see all the thanks and everything. So thank you very much. Like I said, we'll get the recording up. Any stuff coming from Ian, whether it's the slides or a reading list or anything, we'll include in that when we have that stuff ready. So don't worry. And for those of you
on the line, or are we going? Are we staying on the line?
No, we can't really. Us to stay on the line, everyone else would still be able to hear us talking about them.
Okay.
So we can go in. I'll pop you a mail up, but we can disappear because everyone else would still be in the room listening to what we're saying about them. So look, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Everyone watching, I hope you've all enjoyed it. And again, we'll see you Friday if you're there for that one. Otherwise, hopefully we'll catch you on another one of these. And thank you very much. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.